Welcome to another episode of Globetrotting 5. I'm Rudranil Ghosh, and in this episode, we are going to discuss an interesting aspect of Donald Trump's foreign policy, which is to do with his aversion to regime change abroad. Now, it's barely been a month into 2026, and a certain pattern appears to be emerging in Donald Trump's foreign policy, and that is his aversion to effecting regime change in foreign countries. This is, of course, in contrast to previous US administrations that have had no problems with effecting regime change in foreign countries. Of course, in recent memory, we have had Iraq, we have had Afghanistan, we have even had Libya under Obama. So, regime change in foreign countries has definitely been one of the major aspects of US foreign policy over the decades. However, Donald Trump seems to have an aversion to this. Now, why I say that he's not into regime change is because you see the situation in Venezuela. Venezuela, the US went in, removed Nicolas Maduro, physically, literally, removed Nicolas Maduro and his wife, from the presidential palace. And brought them to the United States. But Maduro's regime remains intact in Venezuela. In fact, they seem to be now working together. I mean, Washington and Caracas, they seem to be working together. And Venezuela recently passed some legislation which would allow US oil companies to work and invest in Venezuela's oil sector. And Trump has been clear right from the beginning that he is very much interested in getting a huge stake in Venezuela's oil. So the regime of Nicolas Maduro, which remains intact, Delcy Rodriguez, his vice president, has taken over as interim president, and this regime is actually working with the United States. So there is no regime change per se. I mean, there's a change in leader. Maduro is gone, but his regime remains in place in Venezuela. And Trump was asked this, that why don't you support the democratic opposition forces in Venezuela, after Maduro was removed. And he said that, he doesn't think that they have support. Even Corina Machado, who was awarded the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize, the Venezuelan political activist, and who actually went to the White House and gave her Nobel Prize medal to Trump, as a sign of gratitude and for his support. Even Corina Machado has not been backed by Trump to take over the government in Venezuela, and and he said that he feels that these people just don't have the necessary support in Venezuela. Now, in a different U.S. administration, one can easily imagine that someone like Corina Machado or the other democratic opposition forces in Venezuela would have been supported by Washington to actually take over power, take over government. But Trump is not interested in that. He's not done that. He's not interested in that. He is rather interested in working with the existing regime, the same regime, as represented by Maduro, the same regime. He is interested in working with them to get a better deal for the United States. Now, this is very, very interesting. So what essentially Trump is trying to do is change alliances. If there's a country which is aligned against the United States, he is using pressure. And the pressure can be of different forms, whether it is removing the leader, as in Venezuela, but it can be other things also, sanctions, strikes in case of Iran, and I'll come to Iran in the next segment. He's using pressure to force these incumbent regimes to change their alignment and align more closely with the United States. But the regime stays in place. So, regime change is out of the window in Washington. So, which, to be very frank, may not be a bad idea, because we have seen in the past how US's propensity to effect regime change in other countries has actually had negative consequences. It has backfired, and obviously it has led to huge destruction of lives, of countries, of people. So regime change has led to huge problems for those countries in which they were affected, as well as for the United States, because the United States had to go in militarily and intervene militarily, send their troops, and many American troops were killed. So it was hugely unpopular, and this is also unpopular with Trump's MAGA base. MAGA is very clear that they don't want US troops in foreign countries. I mean, they don't want this muscular interventionist foreign policy where US troops have to be stationed in foreign countries for years in hostile situations. So this is what his MAGA base wants, and Trump is also in a way responding to that. So regime change is now passé in Washington, and a new form of interventionist American foreign policy is coming to the fore. Let's discuss what's happening in Iran. So Trump has threatened more strikes against Iran after you will recall that last summer United States along with Israel had hit Iran's nuclear facilities. US had sent its B-2 bombers to bomb the crucial Iranian nuclear infrastructure. And again this month, Trump threatened more action against Iran, and he moved some military assets, towards the Persian Gulf, and he sent a battle group to the Persian Gulf and moved some military aircraft to the region. So he's threatened to take military action. He also threatened to take military action if Iran killed the protesters, who were protesting against the Ayatollah regime in December and early January. He said that if the Iranian government cracks down on these protesters or kills them or executes them, he will intervene militarily. But what we know so far is that the Iranian government did crack down on the protesters, did kill thousands of these protesters, in that too in a matter of days. They shut down the internet and they just simply started shooting these protesters. With the figures are widely varying. Some say 2,000, 3,000 protesters were killed. Some say more than 20,000 protesters were killed. We may not ever know the exact figure, but they did crack down on the protesters. It was a brutal crackdown. Trump didn't intervene. There was no military intervention on behalf of the protesters. There was no, there were calls. The protesters were literally calling for the United States to intervene and change the regime, because the protesters want to overthrow the Ayatollah regime. But Trump didn't do that. And now what is he saying? Now Trump is saying that, okay, now I'm going to talk to the Ayatollah regime. I'm going to talk to the regime, and we'll try to figure out a new nuclear deal. So American and Iranian negotiators are going to meet this week in Turkey to discuss the possibility of having a new nuclear arrangement for Iran, a new nuclear deal for Iran. So essentially, again, Trump has stepped back from regime change. He is willing to cut a deal with the Ayatollah regime, which is, in his view, beneficial for the United States. So that's all he wants. He wants a better deal for the United States. And the people, the protesters in Iran who died, well, you know, he's washing his hands off them. I mean, he seems to be washing his hands off them, because he said he would intervene on their behalf, but he's not. He is not militarily intervening on their behalf. Rather, he is going in for talks with the Ayatollah regime. So again, another proof, clear proof, that Trump is not interested in regime change. All he wants is to put enough pressure on a particular government to get a better deal for the United States. So even if something happens between US and Iran in the coming days, let's say if there is an escalation in hostilities again, and the US strikes Iran again, I don't think those strikes will actually lead to regime change in Iran. Because that is not what the US under the Trump administration wants to do. If they strike Iran again, possibly with the support of the Israelis, it will again be to sort of weaken the regime in Tehran, so that they can come to the negotiating table and agree to terms which are favorable to America. That is the aim here. Trump doesn't want to change the regime in Iran. In fact, again, like in Venezuela, in Iran, when he was posed this question that why aren't you supporting the opposition forces who want the son of the previous Shah, Reza Pahlavi, why don't you support him to take over the government in Iran? And the answer to that was again very similar to what he said in case of Venezuela. And he said that look, he doesn't feel that the Shah's son, the previous Shah's son, has the support of the people. I mean, which is a little bit weird, because in the protests in Iran, all the protesters, or rather a large section of the protesters, were holding up posters of the Shah's son, and they wanted the return of the Shah. The crying call was Javed Shah, like long live the Shah. But Trump said no. I mean, he doesn't think that they have popular support. So because Trump is not interested in changing the regime in Tehran, he would rather keep the regime in place and then do a deal which is beneficial for America. So that's Iran. The third example that I would like to present to you is the situation in Syria with the Kurds. Now, over January, as many of you would have known, that the Syrian interim government forces clashed with the Kurdish forces in the north and east of Syria. So in these clashes, the Kurdish forces, also known as the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, they lost a lot of ground, and they retreated to their Kurdish strongholds in the north and east. And there were, calls by the Kurds to, help them, because it was clear what was happening here. Turkey, which clearly is influencing the Syrian interim government of Ahmad al-Shara, they are essentially trying to eliminate the Kurdish forces, in Syria, because Turkey sees the SDF, the YPG and the YPJ, the two main components of the SDF. They see them as an extension of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is banned by Turkey and in Turkey, and Turkey essentially sees the PKK as a terrorist group, and so they want to eliminate the Syrian wing of the PKK. Essentially, that's the Turkish viewpoint, mind you. So they are using al-Shara and his forces to push the Kurds into a corner and get them to agree to essentially disarm. Now, here's the issue: the Kurds in Syria are the ones who fought ISIS. Recall that a decade ago, when ISIS was sweeping through Iraq and Syria and was creating, global headlines and turmoil, Kurds at the front line fought ISIS. And they are the ones who defeated ISIS in Syria. The US forces at that time worked with the SDF, would work with the Kurdish forces to defeat ISIS. And as a consequence, the Kurds in Syria were in charge of several prisons in that country that held ISIS fighters and ISIS leaders. Now, with this Syrian government offensive against the Kurds last month, many of those prisons have been taken over by Damascus forces, and many of those fighters have been released. In fact, in these clashes, we saw Syrian government forces actually sporting the ISIS flag. There are several videos of this online. So this is the situation in Syria, and it should not surprise anyone, because Ahmad al-Shara himself was a member of Al-Nusra, the Nusra Front. Which was allied to the Al-Qaeda. Now he's the interim president of Syria, and Turkey has been backing him. It has been backing him since before the fall of Assad. Now, the fall of Assad happened because the Israelis, they kept hitting Syria, which allowed the rebel forces in the north of Syria to sweep through Damascus and remove Assad. And Assad had to flee, and he's in Moscow. So there was a regime change in Syria, but not because of the US. But what has happened since then? Since then, because Assad was seen as an ally of Russia, you've had the Europeans and the Americans willing to work with Ahmad al-Shara. And al-Shara, who was under US sanctions, he and some of his senior interim cabinet members who were on the UN's US sanctions list, they were taken off from those sanctions lists. And because that was part of this rapprochement between Washington and Damascus and the new regime in Damascus. So everyone's trying to help, or rather, curry favor with Damascus. Turkey, who actually is controlling al-Shara, they want to finish the Kurds once and for all. The Kurdish, the armed movement in Syria. Now, when I say armed movement, the Kurds have taken up arms essentially to defend themselves. They defended themselves against ISIS. And remember, those stories of how ISIS was enslaving women, raping underage girls, the Yazidis, the atrocities that the ISIS committed against the Yazidis and Yazidi women. It's the Kurds that fought them at that time. The SDF fought them. The YPJ and the YPG, they fought them. But today, the Americans seem to be just kind of standing aside and saying that, okay, fine, this is, the Syrian government is trying to take over these Kurdish areas, and they seem to have taken a standoff approach. Instead, what happened in the last few days is that they facilitated an agreement, a ceasefire agreement with Damascus and the Kurds, whereby the Damascus forces will be allowed to enter into Kurdish areas, in inter-Kurdish cities like Kamishlo and Hasake, which they have been doing over the last 48 hours, and take over state institutions in those areas. Now, the Kurds' position is that, look, they have, for the past 1 year, been calling for negotiations to integrate their forces with the interim government's forces. In fact, they had an agreement in last March to do this, but nothing happened, after that agreement. So the Kurds are not averse to integration. They want a new Syria where they have an equal stake and they have their rights protected. So they are willing to integrate their forces with the new government forces, the new Syrian government forces, and also integrate their state institutions. The state institutions that the Kurds themselves have built in Rojava, they want to integrate those with the new Syrian state structure. But it seems that the Damascus government wants to dilute the rights of the Kurds. I mean, they want to treat the Kurds like as not as a group, but they want to treat them as individuals and dilute their rights. And the fear is that if that happens, the Kurds will be swamped. Their culture won't be respected. Their language will be suppressed, and there could be suppression and systematic suppression of the Kurds, which is exactly what the Kurds have fought against. Again, just to remind you, Kurds are not asking for a separate homeland. They're asking for a new Syria, a new constitution where their rights are protected. And as per the New Deal, a brigade will be created a division will be created whereby three Kurdish brigades will be integrated into that new division of the Syrian armed forces, and another additional Kurdish brigade in Kobani in northern Syria will again be integrated with the Syrian government forces. But there is a lot of distrust and a lot of things to be worked out, the details to be worked out. But the crucial thing is that the Americans are not standing by the Kurds, and they are essentially playing like they're trying to project themselves as like neutral referees here, and they are not interested in changing the al-Shara regime, even though it was the Kurds that helped them fight ISIS. So finally, let me just quickly wrap up this video. I know it has been a long one, but the evidence today seems to suggest that Trump is not interested in regime change, which in a way is a good thing, because we know with the history of America's regime change obsession that it has had hugely negative consequences. But on the other hand, Trump is approaching foreign policy like a real estate broker. I mean, for him, principles don't matter. All that matters is getting the right deal for America. So he's not going to stand up for democracy. He's not going to defend people who have helped America. All that matters is what is good for America at the moment. So there are no principles here, Well, some might say that, international affairs principles anyway don't matter, but then that also is a problem, because as I mentioned with the Kurds in Syria, if you don't respect the history and if you don't respect, their rights, the fight for equal rights in Syria, then that will also lead to problems down the road. So principles also matter. So that is how things are at the moment. With that, I would like to end this episode of Globetrotting 5. See you in the next.